Welcome back to the Gapfillers Podcast. My name is Michael Bradford. Let's get started here. But before we do, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to help support this podcast. Even by liking or commenting, it helps the algorithm expand our reach in order to reach more people and help influence national, but primarily local Florida politics in order to better direct us into a better future, primarily here in the state of Florida. All right, so the main thing I want to talk about today is the ending of the government shutdown. This has been the longest government shutdown in U.S. history, 43 days, 6 weeks. What has happened is basically this has been used as a political football, as most government shutdowns are, in order to twist the arms of politicians in order to get a vote, and because it looks bad if the government shut down, it hurts the economy. It hurts overall, which is one of the biggest problems I want to get into today about how centralized the federal government is. So before we get into that, let's go on why this shutdown happened. It happened over the government subsidies of the Affordable Health Care Act, the expanded Biden subsidies primarily, which expired during this appropriations year and did not get extended. Now, during Trump's first year, the mandate that was in place for all Americans having over the age of 25 having to get insurance was taken out, which basically gutted the core policy within Obamacare, which required everybody to get it, which would expand the amount of healthy young people, in theory, that were on this plan, or that would be on health insurance, and therefore the unhealthy, or the elderly, or the people that don't qualify for the Medicare, that kind of range, the 40s to 60 area, when they if they get sick, they're more likely to get sick and increase medical bills as you get older, then the younger would fill that hole. Basically, it functioned like a Social Security, and it fails for the same reason that Social Security is failing. Is that there's not as many young people as there once were, compared to as a ratio compared to the older people. So when the older people, in Social Security case, the elderly, the people on Social Security, the retirees, when they did not have as many kids when they were younger, there's not as many working people to support them as a ratio of the economy, and in that case, it hurts the overall program that is fairly socialistic. And so basically, instead of putting off, or instead of worrying about tomorrow, they always kind of kick it to the next year's appropriation through debt and stuff like that. That's why outside of military, Social Security is the highest appropriation that every year, besides now the interest on the debt. So that mandate got gutted, and so after COVID happened and Biden got elected, the Democrats put in an expanded subsidy, which basically is free money for the insurance companies, which in doing so lowers your premiums, but the insurance companies get addicted to that free profit, right? So all that subsidy goes right to the insurance companies. In fact, feeds the problem. It's the same. It's pretty much the same issue that secondary education, or expanded in college and universities have the same problem. Is because it's free money, and it's basically risk-free money given from the federal government, which then allows there's a difference between the risks, and that increases basically it causes an inflation rate, so to speak. This happens pretty much any time the government gets involved in an industry as heavily as education and healthcare. primarily because healthcare costs typically can't be avoided. They're not usually a voluntary procedure or a voluntary cost. They're usually a mandatory cost, whereas education is less mandatory, but people view it as such, and therefore the free money keeps on inflowing. The costs keep going up because it's a bubble is really what it is. It creates an artificial difference between the amount of supply, the amount of cost, and the government fills that gap, which ends up just raising the difference between the two. So it becomes a really bloated industry, and it's not efficient whatsoever. So that's why education costs are so high. Even though the majority of that debt of that free money is actually still lowered onto the consumer, the guarantees of those loans and the bankruptcy, the lack of bankruptcy, causes that free money flow. And so banks are not concerned about how much money they lend out for those. They get those guarantees, and those are not bankruptable. Basically, creating pretty much debt slaves is probably the best way of looking at that, the education one. Now, when it comes to the insurance one or the healthcare, you're creating permanent insurance, which is kind of like the banks. It's the insurance. Insurance is to the healthcare industry like free loans is to the university level industry. So all that money keeps on inflowing to the universities through that, and the insurance companies keep on getting their money through that. So you create this massive bloated system, which is very kind of reminiscent of the late Roman Republic, which, like I've said on previous podcasts, I love history, but you can pretty much guarantee that if you have a political policy, you can find it within the Roman Republic or the Roman Empire at some point. So that ends up being kind of a moot point because you'll end up arguing different points of history, which both are probably correct. So you have these subsidies that didn't get, or the Republicans wanted to expire, and the Democrats wanted to keep those subsidies, but they also viewed it as a win-win, right? So it's no coincidence that right after the November elections, specifically in Virginia, because Virginia has a high amount of federal government employees, especially spillover from D.C., but you also got Virginia Beach, Norfolk, and then you got the Richmond area. But you got a high amount of federal workers in specifically the Alexandria area. And what ends up happening is that they got furloughed because of the government shutdown, which the Democrats kind of used as a bargaining tool, a political tool to get their governor and their AG elected in those elections. Now, and then the Democrats were able to use that as a tool, also those elections as a tool to tout how the Republicans are in disarray, which they are, and we'll get into that after in the next segment. But what ends up happening is that they'll use that as a tool, and then immediately after, Tim Kaine wants to come in and play. I'm going to compromise. Well, right after those elections, so. In fact, we probably need an expansion of the fiscal year over into the more aligned with the calendar year, which will maybe not the calendar year, maybe the month after, maybe like late January, February, because of the holiday recess. In order to prevent that from being the government shutdowns from being used as an late electoral tool to cross that finish line. Because that could be used in the future so we could see government shutdowns used in the future to get to that November, that Tuesday time frame. So, so basically that's what happened. Now, as Politico did a poll recently, and they found that it was basically a political wash, probably because we're so divided, that 50% blamed Republicans and 47% blamed Democrats, and that 3% could easily be made up with a margin of error, but there's also just tends to be about a 50-50 split as far as the country goes right now. Now, how can Florida defend against this in the future? Well, we had a government shutdowns, or we had furloughs and flight cancellations happen because of the running out, the furloughing of air traffic controllers, which Central Florida and Miami, primarily those two are highly tourist destinations. So the cancellation of flights would severely hurt those two industries, those two metropolitan area cities or economies. Excuse me, and so in order to better prepare for this in the future, we can't depend on the federal government to consistently not agree and then us be screwed from it. So what Florida should really look at doing is becoming more autonomous with as much things as possible, taking back power from the federal government and instituting it at the Florida level. Now, we have a good budgetary surplus, which will allow us maneuverability in this, which also allows us kind of to maneuver within this process in order to maybe take state control of national parks that are exclusively within the Florida boundaries, probably like the Ocala National Forest in the Everglades, different things like that. Now, those need to still maintain a high decorum of regulation, primarily with the Everglades, with how sensitive the habitat is down there. But overall, it should be more centralized control in order to prevent some, two states up north from disagreeing and hurting the Florida economy when we have nothing to do with that. So those should be brought within Florida control, and I would also suggest the TSA. There are airports that have private security outside of the TSA. I would suggest that Florida possibly make its own regulations around those. Now, it would be hard to get around. I would like to see the TSA for the most part go away, but without that being the further step, what we should do is we should institute our own state programs in order to take back the power from the federal government. And as far as air traffic controllers, that is a more specialized multi-state problem. Now, a lot of those have to do with direct airports, so we might be able to get away with that, like direct airspace taking back, having locally funded controllers at like the Miami or the Orlando International Airport or Tampa. Jacksonville would probably be harder because you'll probably have air traffic controllers directing over Georgia, which would then become a federal issue, unless we can somehow get a Georgia-Florida kind of alliance, so to speak, but that would probably have to take a federal step because it crosses state borders, becomes interstate as opposed to intrastate. So those are three topics that I kind of looked at that, especially when it comes to flights and federal lands within that are exclusively within one state. There really should be no reason that a lot of states are funded federally, federal parks. They can be set aside and sequestered, but if Virginia or North Carolina or Wyoming is going to benefit from a national park, a lot of their the state expenditures should be towards that, as opposed to federal funds inflowing into that state for a reason that only benefits that state. So, so say like Yellowstone, or I know that that crosses borders, but those states should import that money. They get those tax revenues from people visiting, spending money within the state and flying in and spending money on food and lodging and stuff like that. So a lot of those funds should actually go to fund the state or fund the federal lands, the national parks that are within those, but they should become more of a state autonomous, federally, they're federal zones, but should be state run, so to speak. This will allow the federal government shutdowns not to affect that as much. In fact, you could see an inflow of direct appropriations probably into those, so like trash pickup, because these national parks didn't shut down. A majority of these national parks stayed open. They just didn't have park rangers, so they didn't have safety. They didn't have trash pickup. They didn't have construction. All those could have easily been picked up by those states. And so, maybe have the National Park Service still act as a general. It should act as a general directorate, so to speak, but not a direct funding at every single point. And so we could probably cut down a lot of the federal spending, and that will be picked up as from the states. Now, how that looks overall, that's a point to be debated. But you could probably do those with a large majority of federal programs, and in doing so, reduce and more federalize the program as put forth by Senator Mike Lee from Utah. Basically, expanding the federalization without the federal government, because those are even though they sound the same, those are two highly different things. In fact, they're polar opposites. The bigger your federal government is, the less federalism there is, because the Federalists basically are combined states, and Alexander Hamilton was probably the biggest Federalist, but he went overboard. In fact, what has become a centralized state, as opposed to the Anti-Federalists, which basically wanted independent zones completely. The Federalists basically said we can interact where we interact, but each state should have its own jurisdiction, and that's the way it should be. And over the past 250 years, that's become less and less. States become more of less actual borders and more actual. They become more kind of like, I don't know. They become their own little thing that less and less power, because more resources are concentrated at the top, and it's easier to convince 450 people in one legislature as opposed to 50 different smaller legislatures and having to deal with those state lines. And so that's why the government has been so consolidated in the upper echelons of national government. Lastly, the last point I want to make on this topic specifically is that this ends up creating more power within the executive branch as the legislature becomes more and more divisive. The federal government interacts on a more bureaucratic executive branch level, and that's where a lot of our regulations have come from. Whether Congress can constitutionally give away their powers is a whole nother matter to be debated. I fully disagree, but that's the idea. That's the general idea that happens with when you have a splintered Senate or House of Representatives. The power is basically, when people are demanding something get done, it convolutes into the center of executive power, which is the president. And that becomes a problem that has perpetually expanded pretty much in every single republic ever, that eventually leads on implosion or explosion. Basically, implosion becomes civil war, or explosion becomes centralized government under a dictatorial power tyrant kind of look. So the next thing I want, and in fact that leads me to the next segment that I want to deal with today, is the splintering of the parties that has recently developed within the government shutdown. We have a lot of disagreement. Now, the Republicans were always, and Trump came to power on a kind of a coalition government look with RFK and Tulsi Gabbard teamed up with Tucker Carlson and Ben Shapiro, and then you had some of the more neocon kind of takes. Ben Shapiro was in there, but Senator Graham, Lindsey Graham, I almost call him Billy, and then Ted Cruz, and they have become more of the look of expanding federal power as the Republicans have over worldwide hegemony, so to speak. And then you have more of the libertarian-esque, the Tucker Carlson. Then you have you have even by the splintering of the groups, basically, you have created more open air for other people like Nick Fuentes, which is a kind of a dangerous route to come from because the momentum never stops, and that becomes the ultimate problem when you have a character like him in there, is that you end up with momentum because he identifies a problem just like the communists do, but the communists don't know when or the socialists identify the problem and institute the wrong thing, whereas Nick Fuentes probably is going to be doing the same thing. Now, not to say he doesn't have a point when it comes to the federal government defending national interest and the people who are here, nativism as opposed to nationalism, because nativism tends to be self-rule, take care of ourselves, more isolationist, which has gotten a bad rap, and then you have nationalism, which actually tends to be more all-conquering, so to speak. So you have a splintering in that group. But recently you've also seen a splintering within the Democrats, again, between their more progressive, socialistic, communistic Mamdani types, and then Nancy Pelosi retiring, and then Jeffries coming in and kind of filling her role, and then Chuck Schumer fighting with those types. But then you have John Fetterman, who's kind of a wild card within the Democrats because he is more like an old Democrat and wanting to not just show evil, just shout down somebody, as call somebody Hitler or something, but at the same time he seems to be more trying to position himself as a more moderate. Now he, because of his medical issues, probably can't get more than senator because of that. So his political ambitions are kind of hampered, which also is probably why he's content playing that moderate look. He's probably used as a political tool of the establishment, specifically as the establishment Democrats. But so you have a splintering between those kind of groups. Because the Democrats don't go far enough for their progressive counterparts or colleagues, and so Ocasio-Cortez, and so you're ending up with a power vacuum, and so they're also calling for a more strenuous primary election next year with the midterms because there's such a wide opportunity that they see supposedly. With the elections in Virginia specifically, and then that there's a lot of people rushing to fill that vacuum. So you're possibly looking at what would be like a 15-person primary in the Republican general election a few years ago, 2016 or even 2020. No, not 2020. 2016 and 2024. That basically you end up with that kind of look. Anyways. So what are we gonna kind of looking at here? You're looking at probably you're looking at a really big issue when it comes to factionalization, because whoever does come up on top usually, as history would show, comes through with more centralized power. And the fringe elements typically win in a revolutionary outlook because of the way that kind of worked, because the system kind of implodes on itself with the two extremes coming on top. Specifically, like the Gracchi brothers during the late Roman Republic. Like I said, not going to go into that too much, but you're looking at that. So highly factionalized areas, and you're not going to get a really good. You're not really going to get a really good outlook as far as policy advancement goes, probably in the near future, especially with Trump. The implosion of what looks like an implosion. This isn't like a, MAGA is finished. As we've said over the past since 2016, so a decade. But overall, it looks like Trump has pivoted drastically away from pretty much everything that his base wanted. And you're starting to see major division between that, especially with H-1B visas and supporting foreign alliances, and as well as specifically the Epstein files seem to be very hampering, divisive over on the right. But how we coalesce around that is left to be seen. I don't actually have a medicine for that right now, but that's something to keep an eye out. With that being said, thank you for joining me for this week. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment. I look forward to seeing you in the future, and have a good one.